Hey everyone, welcome to Thinking Christian, and in this video I'm going to address the question, isn't saying God is good just saying God is God, because we're assuming God is sort of the source of good or embodies good in some particular way. So I want to give two particular responses to this. This is actually something that used to bother me, and it bothered me because I tend to be pretty hardcore about these analytic things, and I'm not saying that's always a good thing. In fact, if you've never had this question, that's a good thing. So this video probably won't do you any good because you already are fine just saying God is good and that being a meaningful statement. But to me, there's always something that bothered me about this, and I'm going to give two reasons. The first one's a very simple reason, and the second one goes into a little bit more detail. But I think it's still interesting to talk about. So let's go ahead and get started. So by God, I'm just going to take the definition. Look, creator and ruler of the universe and source of all moral authority, the supreme being. And Merriam-Webster defines God as the supreme or ultimate reality. And good being defined as basically the Google Dictionary, which has some good definitions. Look, to be desired or approved of, or the Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines it as deserving of respect. And I want to mention that, notice here what should signal is that there's some level of teleology to the word good. There's some level of to be doneness, like it deserves respect. There's an ought-based component, or to be desired, ought to be desired or approved of. These are notions in good. So one of the things that if we look at these two words by these definitions, obviously they're two separate things. The difficulty comes is saying when we say God is good by his own nature, then saying God is good isn't really seem to be doing anything meaningful until we start digging a little bit deeper. So the first thing just has to do with the distinction between character and nature. So the subtlety is on the word is. So one of the things you can say is God is this entity that has a lot of different attributes. I think the Catholic doctrine is that God has this divine simplicity, but it involves all of these different these different attributes. And I think the analogy used is often like a prism, like you have light, but you can also split the light into these other different colors by shining it through a prism if you want to see those colors. But the divine simplicity is just like God is God's nature. They're all just part of God. The difficulty, I think, is the fact that we can't imagine a God without a good nature. We can imagine an evil God and these sorts of things. So we can ask the question, is it necessary that God is good? And I actually don't know. I mean, that's an interesting sort of question. Can we imagine a creator of the universe that isn't a good being? That's possible. Would this being still be the source of moral authority? Well, that's a good question. But if this is the case, then when we say God is good, we are rightly attributing good to God's character. We are saying God is good because it is not necessarily the case that God has to be good. Now, not all theists are going to agree with me on this. There are many theists who are going to define God, and I think it depends where you start your definition of God. If you start God as the creator of everything, then saying you need to go from there to goodness, versus if you start with God being the definition of goodness, now you need to argue for having creative powers. And while these two seem like separate things, you could argue that they're similar or they're the same because of teleology. There's like an ought-based component, like God is the source of all good, and there's a teleological impetus to creation as well. There's creation for a reason, and if God is good, this creation is for a good reason because is from God. So that's one way you can go. I don't want to get too far in the weeds. I'm already getting in the weeds here. But really the distinction here is just the fact that it's not analytically equal to this. When we say God is good or God is the source of goodness, we don't just mean that goodness itself is necessarily analytically equal to good. Rather, goodness is a part of God's character, or what we understand when we say good is, this particular part of God's character, but God also having, other attributes as well, like, I don't know, creative power or something like that. And one of the ways you can see this is, look, I can just tell you my dog is playful. When I say this, I'm not saying my dog is just equal to the entity playful. My dog is not analytically equal to playfulness, but my dog has the attribute of playful. And similarly, when we say God is good, we are saying God's attribute or God's character is good or is the source of good. That is a cognitively meaningful statement. So that's like the surface level, the first way you could go about just answering this question and put this issue to rest. But there's another issue too, not another issue, but there's another way you can look at this that I think sheds some more light on what's going on here as well. And this has to do with the teleology of the word good, the function that the word good plays, and we're going to get into some philosophy of language here, some very basic philosophy of language, because not my area of expertise. So the subtlety here is on the word good. Now, let's look at G.E. Moore's open question argument, which was written in 1903 in Principia Ethica, where he basically makes the following argument. If X is analytically equivalent to good, then the question, is it true that X is good, is meaningless, because you could just replace X with good, and you'd just be saying good is good. Premise 2, the question, is it true that X is good, is not meaningless, i.e. it is an open question, and his conclusion, therefore X is not analytically equivalent to good. Now, I think this is an interesting argument. I think this is actually a good argument, but I think where the theist is going to push back is basically on premise 1. God is not analytically equivalent to good, so the statement God is good is not a tautology. But there are theists who do think God is analytically equivalent to good. But I'm going to argue, even if God is analytically equivalent to good, then the question, is it true that X is good, is not meaningless. And I'm going to make that statement by basically showing this sense reference distinction. So one of the things, and this was Gottlieb Frege, who came up with this idea of the sense of a word versus the reference of a word. And this is a very important distinction. Now, this was written in, I believe, 1896. So this was a little bit before Principia Ethica. But he basically talks about the ways in which words can serve different purposes depending on basically the context that they're used in. So imagine I have two propositions. The first one is me saying 2 + 2 = 4. And proposition 2 is just saying the word FOUR, 4, equals the number 4. Now, in this case, yes, 2 + 2 = 4 is analytically equal to 4. And when I by definition, me spelling out FOUR = 4, that, those things are analytically equal. These are both true by definition, right? But because one can accept proposition 1 without accepting proposition 2. So let's say you're not a native English speaker. Let's say you speak Chinese, but you're familiar with Arabic numerals. You may know premise 1 is analytically true, but premise 2 may be meaningless to you because the letters FOUR in this character, they're like, English letters that are in an orientation that's nonsensical to you. So the meaning of these two propositions is different, even though they're expressing the same thing. So what this particular thing is going to argue is, even if God is analytically equivalent to good, which some people and some philosophers and theologians are going to argue, then in this case, you can still get around this issue by using the sense-language distinction. Basically, what 2 + 2 is doing, it's referring to the number 4. If I evaluate 2 + 2, I get 4. So 2 + 2 is referencing 4, and the word FOUR is also referencing for 4. So the reference in both of these is the same, but the sense in which they're used is not. So as a result, the thought of these two sentences is different because of the sense of the word. So 2 + 2 is 4, but the reason I'm using it in this way is to express a mathematical expression. I'm saying 2 and 2 together. So when I say 2 + 2 = 4, is what I'm saying is this expression evaluates to 4. And when I say FOUR = 4, what I'm basically saying is that the letters, like the English characters F + O + U + R put together in this way, gives me what I'm referring to as the number 4, the Arabic numeral 4, which refers to like the mathematical idea of like 4 items, that particular thing. So once again, even though these two sentences do technically or analytically express the same thing, the sense of these two words is different, and as a result, what Frege would consider the thought of each of these sentences is going to be slightly different as well. Once again, premise 1 is expressing a formula or an expression, and premise 2 is basically a translation in that particular way. So one of the things that happens here is, one of the reasons this distinction is important is because we don't always use good in the most analytic way. We're sometimes sloppy with that, and that's okay. I used to be very anal about these things, but you know what? That's just part of the beauty of language and the overloading of the human in any sort of language, really. It's just kind of how it goes. So when I say X is good, what I'm doing, what I'm going to argue is going on here is I'm not referring to a natural property. X can be a natural property. X can be whatever it is. But goodness serves the function, or the sense of the word good in this particular case is attaching prescription to it. So attaching to be doneness to it. So good is the attachment of prescription. If you look into the philosopher R.M. Hare, he had a lot to say about prescription, and this is kind of my take on it. I didn't realize R.M. Hare did some of this stuff, although I was familiar with him, but I think my views may be somewhat similar, but also different than his. Whereas what I'm saying is when I say X is good, I'm saying one ought to pursue X. Goodness is attaching the ought to be doneness or the ought to be doneness to something that's either a natural property or an object that has no prescriptive weight or value. And as a result, and as I've argued before, this allows Sam Harris, when Sam Harris says human flourishing is good, he's actually saying something meaningful. He's actually saying something that's beyond a tautology. When he says human flourishing is good, he's saying one ought to promote human flourishing. And human flourishing is just a thing. It has no prescriptive nature. There's no to be doneness. You just say human flourishing, like whatever. But me telling you, like, you ought to promote human flourishing, that's actually saying something meaningful because you're attaching something that has a prescriptive vehicle to the term human flourishing, which we understand. So we're moving to saying something actually useful and meaningful. So as a result, when we say God is good, we are saying God is that which is to be desired by his own nature, or alternatively, God is the source of all prescriptions by his nature. And as a result, these are saying interesting things. We are actually doing theology when we say God is good. We are saying, we can know good because we can know God. And you can say a lot of these other things. So that's the thought that's being said here. So once again, when somebody says something is good, I don't think they're doing it. I think Moore points out a really interesting distinction here. And as a result, this caused me to realize when people say something is good, they're not really always invoking an idea of goodness as a natural object. They're saying a to be doneness to do it. When I say honesty is good, I'm saying one ought to be honest. When I say God is good, I'm basically saying God is that which is to be desired, or one ought to desire God because that is his nature and that is like the way things ought to be. And sort of that's like ultimate goodness, like the nexus of goodness. So anyway, thanks for watching. I hope this cleared it up. Maybe it just asked a bunch more questions, but it certainly cleared it up for me, and I'm satisfied with either of these responses. So let me know what you think. If you've never struggled with this, hopefully I didn't just open up a can of worms. But if you're on the more analytic side, if you're an engineer like myself, then hopefully this will maybe give some interesting thoughts of what people mean when they say God is good, what they're trying to express. So thanks for watching, and see ya.